Let's start for those in the room and online. There is a interpretation in French and English, so you can have the question in French or English. There will be interpretation, and I will share this panel. But before doing that, I will just put this big conference in perspective, because it's the first time that we organize first 15 panels, and that we call the academic part and now the open part. So they just to make some link between the two parts. I will not summarize that because that will be at the end of the conference, but a little bit the logic, and then I give the floor to the opening panel. So why we decide to have something about inequality? I think it came from internal discussion at the ETUI when we had a forecast exercise between foresight exercise between the team, and then we had two keywords that will shape the future, was climate change and inequalities. And climate change, we had already different activities, but inequalities, we said that's really, we have to go a little bit deeper on that. And we use this big conference, and the idea of the big conference is the fifth one that we organize with ETUC. It's always a joint initiative between ETUC and ETUI. The logic is that we organize a lot, both organizations, a lot of activities, but at one point on some topic, it's important to have something a little bit bigger, because if you want to put in the public debate, if you want to have some influence, sometimes it's a good idea to put more resource, more effort, and then to try to influence the political agenda and the ideas for the ETUI. And we did that, and I say that already thanks to a fantastic team, Sophie, Maria, all the admin, the researcher, trainers. They did a fantastic job to organize that, because when all goes well, it looks easy, but there is a lot of work to organize 15 panel and now 5 plenaries. So what was the basic idea is the return of the question of inequalities. And then what is interesting is on inequalities, there were some debate about inequalities. I know it seems that everyone, all the institutions agree. ILO, we are not so surprised, but OECD, IMF, the central bank, even DG ECFIN, sometimes I agree that inequalities is a problem. And that's important because it changed this period is very different than the one we had 10 years ago. But we said, okay, it's interesting that we have the consensus about, or some consensus about inequalities as a key problem, but what about the future? What about equality? Because if we agree to be against inequality, what is the project about equality? And that's why we put this idea of blueprint. Or can we think a project, what kind of equality we want? Full equality, partial equality, going to our more equality? That was a debate that we had in the academic session. So we will not find the solution here, and we are not, but we are here to engage a debate, to engage something about equality, about what we think is important. And for that, I think that we have to be happy. And happy, when I say happy, we have to think about the actors, we have to think about the policies, and we have to think about the institution. That's really important to have a program about equality, which was not just the equality about the equality of chance, but perhaps to return to equality of outcomes, or what was said, transformative equality, which changed the situation that you have. Because you change the situation, you improve equality in different domains. So I stop there. I think one of the lessons of the academic debate was that is much more complex than we thought. But when you put academics together, that's a normal conclusion. So we have more to say, but we will say that at the end. And now we let, and that's the idea of the different panels, the actors, the institution, to have the debate, because as I said, you don't have a fight against inequality or a project about equality without actors and mainly the trade unions. So thank you, and that's more or less the link. I move to my role of chair that I can sit. And for this panel, I will present each speaker one-to-one. We have not the chance because we co-organize, so that's normal that you are here, Luca. The opening will be by Luca, General Secretary of the ETUC, and I give you the floor, and if you can go to the podium so people online can have this nice background, which I was said by the Compub team that is important.
Okay, so thank you very much, Philippe, and good afternoon, everybody. First of all, it's really a pleasure to be here in presence after so many years of lockdowns and isolation, and just online meetings is really appreciated, I think, by all of us. And second, thank you very much to the ETUI, to Philippe, to the directors, to the staff of the ETUI for having organized again together with us this very important conference and moment for reflection. I think this appointment, you say it 5 years, is already 5 times that we
5 times,
yeah, that we do it. So it means 10 years, actually. It's really a good sign, I mean, of the commitment of the ETUI together with the ETUC to put together academics, people active in the social fields, institutions, and prominent figures, I mean, in the public debate about social matters. So I think it's a great opportunity every time we organize this kind of conferences to have a discussion, an in-depth discussion, but also to think out of the boxes. That is the most important thing for the kind of, let's say, encouragement of, to thinking that we would like to generate with this kind of initiatives. And I think it was a very good idea to put inequalities and equality at the core of the discussion for this year. Also because we come out, or we are still in, incredible crisis that have worsened the situation even further when it comes to equality, inclusion, and social justice in Europe and in the rest of the world. Before the pandemic, you remember, some of you participated in previous discussions, and we were already reflecting on the effects that globalization, financiarization of the economy, and then the financial and economic crisis at global level, 2008, 2011, the austerity policies that follow, and the wrong recipes that were implemented, particularly in the European Union, the effects that all this had in terms of social disruption, exclusion, poverty, and also inequalities. The problem is that after that, there was a little moment, a little period of recovery. This economic recovery, unfortunately, didn't mean social recovery, because if we compare, just to make a couple of examples, the level of inequalities before and after the economic and financial crisis, this level increased even after the recovery kicked in, and the same is valid for the labor markets. If you compare the number of hours worked before 2008 and the number of hours worked in Europe by workers, working people, in 2017, 2018, this number didn't increase by 1 single hour. On the contrary, shrinked. Despite of the fact that if you measure the figures about employment generated, number of jobs, etc., when this sort of recovery kicked in, there was apparently an increase in number of jobs, but clearly it was just precarious jobs, non-protected, with lower salaries, with very few working hours, etc., etc. Is what we called at that time the so-called jobless recovery, that worsened the situation even more after the austerity measures. And of course, after that, we had COVID kicking in. This has paralyzed and suspended, let's say, the economy, the labor market, the functioning of our societies for more than 1.5 years. we manage, I say we because we participated as social partners, our trade union movement, in the design of some emergency measures that were implemented a couple of years ago to try to save jobs and to protect people during these lockdowns and this suspension of our normal life. We managed to have these emergency measures put in place with an extraordinary, very ambitious, I have to say, effort from the European institutions. They were not capable to implement the same kind of effort after the economic and financial crisis. On the contrary, they went the wrong way with austerity policies and cuts. During the pandemic, at least 500 billion euros of emergency measures, 200 of which for support to employment and also money for public healthcare services. So, I mean, something important that have allowed us to save more than 40 million jobs in the European Union. It's not peanuts, it's something very important. So 40 million people didn't lose their jobs because of these emergency measures. And after that, this extraordinary plan for investment called Next Generation EU, with problems, of course, lack of involvement of social partners sometimes, especially at national level, in implementing the national recovery plans, and also a lack of conditionalities for making sure that this time we will have a job-rich recovery with stable labor being created, etc. But nevertheless, a very massive, ambitious investment, very well focused on climate transition, etc., etc. These had started contributing, improving the level of equality, but there was not enough time to achieve all this. So the progress was very little. And after the progress was started, kicking in, we had this horrific war in Ukraine that is affecting the whole of Europe, and is having not only consequences in terms of deaths, in terms of violation of human rights, of course, war crimes, etc., which is, of course, horrible. And we all condemn the war, the invasion of Russia against Ukraine, and we all support with total solidarity Ukrainian people, Ukrainian trade unions, putting in place enormous efforts, I mean, for humanitarian aid, solidarity, etc. But we have also to consider that this war is again disrupted completely the internal social cohesion of our continent, our capacity to rebuild an economic model that is more fair and more inclusive, and is increasing, therefore, inequalities even more. Inequalities are really cross-cutting. Because it's not just and only the fact that employees' salaries are 100 times lower than the income of the rich people. So there is for sure, first of all, of course, an income inequality that affects the people we represent. But then this is linked to many other things, because it's linked also to the precariousness in the labor market, the fact that jobs are not protected, and this worsens the situation even further. It's linked to the fact that we have very often taxation systems that are absolutely unequal and that are affecting particularly the poorer people in the society, across the different areas of the society, and favor corporates, rich people with very low level of taxation. And of course, this is even worsened by tax avoidance, corruption, tax evasion, etc., etc. But then inequality, as I said, is cross-cutting the different areas of the economy, because also when we go for competitiveness rules, international trade rules, supply chains, protection or non-protection of human and workers' rights in the different economic contexts, we see that the inequalities are also there. And also in addressing the let's say, historical challenges that we have in front of us, like climate change, digitalization, automation, and so on, we see that we are not able still to protect people significantly and efficiently, because we still can offer to people that are affected by climate change and by transitions more or less just a bit of training, sometimes a bit of pre-retirement schemes of social protection. But when it comes to offering a real job in alternative to the job they are going to lose, offering this job as a quality job, and making sure that this job can be found in the same very community where the jobs are going to be disrupted. Well, all this is not happening. So there are many aspects, not to mention, of course, the access to social protection, to public services, to healthcare, to vaccines. After COVID, this became another element boosting inequalities in Europe, within Europe, not to mention the rest of the world, of course. So all these elements, public services, etc. So there are too many things, too many fields where inequalities have really affected the people, the working people and the people we represent. And I think it's very important not only to denounce this phenomena, it's not only important to understand what the historical background and the developments that have led to this kind of situation are. This is crucial, of course, but then it has to be the background to try to design solutions, as Philippe was rightly saying. And the first element we need to consider if we want to implement proper solutions is that what kind of approach we have to the issue of inequalities and building equality. Too often, unfortunately, the element of addressing inequalities and building equality has been a compensatory approach. So since there are some categories of the society, of the labor market that are affected by inequalities, we try to compensate by putting in place some bonuses, a bit of social protection, some kind of measures that can help, let's say, rebalancing a bit. The problem is that if we don't embed in the economic system, first of all, rethinking completely our development model, our growth model, if we don't embed the concept of equality as equality of opportunities, first of all, but also equality of outcomes, and we don't include actual effective processes for ensuring that we have equality of opportunities in the starting point and also equality of outcomes at the end of the processes, well, we will just continue spending public money to compensate people that have been affected. And this is not the right way to address the problem. Therefore, for us, there are at least three big issues that we would like, everybody to understand that should be at the core of the strategy of each and every actor at institutional political level, but also as social partners in the society, etc. The first is that we really need to rethink the economic model in a fairer, more inclusive and just manner. And this means that we need really to develop even further some reflections that also the ETUI has brought forward in the last few years on how an economy at the service of people, at the service of well-being, going beyond a mere GDP indicator as the only reference, for measuring economic growth, an economy that can really build, a society where everybody can have the fair share, how we can design an economic model like that, not just an economy that services the profits of the big multinational companies or just the interest of some politicians, some oligarchs, some power groups in this or that country, in this or that society. Well, that's the real reflection that we need to develop. And structuring an economy like that means putting a lot of emphasis on public investment, on how the public investment should be channeled, what conditionalities should be put when public money is spent to obtain what results in terms of job creation, in terms of protection, in terms of social justice, in terms of public services, how we can introduce taxation systems that are fairer towards people, individuals, but also towards companies, towards businesses and economic interests in a way that everybody can really be safe in the economy and not being just, let's say, affected by stronger interests that can destroy completely the opportunity of common people to develop. So this element of introducing a new concept of the economic model and new rules in the economy is the first starting point to build a more equal world. The second element, of course, is how to manage the transitions, the climate transition, the digital transition, but we have also labor transition that is going on because there are too many new forms of work that are not regulated, that are not protected. So we need really to reconceive completely the kind of governance. It's not just and only about, as I said before, putting in place some instruments like training, like social protection. It has to be a different governance. We need to have all the actors coming together, designing the future, generating investment, being focused in the communities that are going to be affected, and making sure that people can be really protected and accompanied in this kind of transition processes. And last but not least, there is an issue about how to build what we call the new social contract. Our social model has been broken by the different crises we have been gone through, and also by the wrong policies that have been implemented so far. So how to rebuild a social model where fundamental human and social rights are respected, but also we can offer a safety net of social protection that can really give equal access and protection to everybody. So these elements are also fundamental if we want to have a society, an economy, a labor market that can really offer opportunities for equalities to all. And all this becomes even more important and more pressing, I will say, in the moment when we have a war that, of course, we counteract in any way to build democracy, to build peace, to make sure that we can come back to a normal situation and this war can stop and the deaths can stop. At the same time, we have also to take care of the consequences of this war. And while we support, of course, the sanctions as one of the elements, the fundamental tools to put a stop, put an end to this war, we have also to take care of the people we represent. We cannot ignore that we have a skyrocketing inflation, an explosion of a bubble when it comes to energy prices, to food crisis, that we have many jobs at risk because of the disruption in the supply chains. So all this must be addressed. And at the moment, our two top priorities that are also important to build equality are, on the one side, to support the wages of people. Because if you have 8% on average in Western Europe and 20% in Eastern Europe as the level of inflation at the moment, after years and years of negative inflation, we are at risk of having an explosion in our societies. If we don't address the problem of increasing wages through collective bargaining, through legal minimum wages, we need absolutely to have a pay rise immediately for European and also global workers. And on the other side, we cannot have the illusion that increasing wages can cope with inflation, because if we increase wages by 20%, the day after you will have 30% of inflation and then 40%. So we need to have a mix. We have to be wise, in the way we address the problems. We need to have a mix between a reasonable increase in wages on the one side, and on the other side, we need to complement this with social measures for income support, for putting a cap to energy prices, for making sure that people can continue getting access to housing, to energy supply, to healthcare, to public services, and so on and so forth. And this requires, again, social investment from the different governments. And this must not generate additional public debt and additional deficit. That's why we are advocating so strongly with the European Union at the moment for strong measures of support like the ones that we were able to put in place during the COVID pandemic, like SURE and the other emergency measures that were implemented at that time. So we need really a comprehensive strategy, and we need to have a vision about how we want to reshape the society, how we want to reshape the economy and the labor market in a more equal way, in a more just way for everybody, in a way that everybody can really enjoy a decent well-being for the future. And this, I think, is the message that we have to spread around every day, and it has to inspire our daily action. And we can never give up, and we can never ever rest, unfortunately, because this is the moment for action. Thank you very much again, and welcome to the conference.
Thank you, Luca, for this inspiring opening speech. And now the next speaker is Evelyne Régnier. You are Vice President of the European Parliament, but you are a friend of the ETUC and ETUI for a long time. So we are very happy that you have found time to be with us. I think that you have to leave after your presentation because there is obligation in the Parliament. But thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
So, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests here in the room and also watching online, And above all, of course, dear Luca, dear Philippe, on behalf of ETI and ETUC, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for including a little bit the European Parliament's perspective on an issue that is crucial, of utmost importance for every society at every time, and especially right now, talking about equality. I speak on behalf of the European Parliament, as you see, and as speaking today also on behalf of Roberta Metsola, the President of the European Parliament. I may be a little bit more formal than I'm normally, because of course supporting everything and underlining what especially Luca said right now in his overview, in his input as a strong trade unionist, Secretary General of ETUC, so giving us the architecture. On behalf of the European Parliament, which I have the honor to represent today, of course, I would like to thank including us. The inequalities, the topic, so you raise what to tackle inequalities and what to do in order to achieve more equality, of course, is of utmost importance now and in the upcoming months, I can assure, I would say in the upcoming years. Just now in the European Parliament, we voted on a resolution about the accession of Ukraine, Moldova, and possibly Georgia. And of course, this is a very symbolic and important issue, an important vote. But you, as trade unionists, you know very much and very well that we have to look very carefully and very closely at social rights, at collective bargaining, at trade union rights, as well as the rule of law, democracy, our values. All this needs to be guaranteed. And this is a question of equality. You all know we are living in a multitude of crises: pandemic, war, climate change, and ever-rising prices. The inequalities and the resulting insecurity among citizens is visible every day. Right-wing parties, like in France, are gaining power. Social markets have to provide food for more and more people. In my home country, Austria, that is always regarded as one quite balanced country concerning social security. So inequalities are rising everywhere in Europe, and inequalities rising also within generations and between generations. So it's mostly also young people queuing up in these social markets and struggling with their mental health. Especially since the pandemic, I also noticed something less and less, and I just come to another issue, but you will see in the end is very closely linked. I see less and less women were on TV in interviews, less and less women were visible. This is something we need to change, make the female decision makers everywhere heard, and also increase the share of women in all levels of decision making. On the latter, and I think most of you know, after 10 years, we finally reached a hallmark agreement on a directive you all probably know as the Women on Boards Directive. So equality is also talking about gender equality. A much better gender balance around the board tables of Europe benefits our businesses, as we know more diverse viewpoints at the top of organizations can lead to better decision making, higher resilience, and more innovation. But not only that, it also improves the role of women everywhere, challenges stereotypes, and will address one of the biggest challenges, an often very hostile workplace environment. We are always aware that directive opens a door, a very heavy door that took us 10 years to open. And we all know that there is more to do to really achieve a workplace without discrimination. Yet we have finally added another piece to the puzzle. So it's about pieces of puzzle in order to achieve equality. Here, of course, we also need to make sure that the surrounding questions of gender equality are tackled for a truly equal playing field. What do I mean by this? If you look at time, for example, there is this saying that we all only have 24 hours a day. But mathematically speaking, of course, this is correct. But if you're a woman, I can assure you these 24 hours are spent drastically different than if you're a man, even if you work the same job. And this has a major impact on salaries, on care duties, on career progression. So also here, we have to talk about equality. Not only are women less seen in many cases, they also, on average, work much more than men, no matter their social status. And in the classical business sector with 9 to 5 frameworks, they still exist somewhere, over hours and flexibility not chosen by then women, this becomes a real obstacle. And the data here is very clear. This is why we're in the middle of negotiations on pay transparency, yet another important piece of the puzzle and yet another important piece to achieve equality. I now have highlighted the gender aspects of inequality, which is a key priority of the European Parliament and intrinsically linked to many other questions of inequality. It is a part of the big puzzle of social equality in our ever-changing society. Now, when we see the fossil energy companies profiting from a war to the detriment of millions of people, as politicians, we need to propose solutions. And you are a big part of achieving this, and that's due to the excellent work of the ETUC and the trade unions, and of course with the support of the excellent background information of ETI, we achieved a minimum wage agreement. This can be a massive step forward for everyone in Europe. It's not a magic spell, of course, we know that. But again, you all know the stronger trade unions are, the better the life of everyone. And this is another piece to this whole puzzle. Before I finish, let me quickly point out that we all are aware that much more has to be done. We need a European wealth tax. I speak it out again and again because this is something many people don't take into their mouth. We need a European wealth tax, a minimum corporate tax, and a strong Green Deal that I always call a strong green and red deal, because it has to have a strong red heart, otherwise it won't work. It needs to take people on board when we are doing everything what we decided today and have to decide and implement in the next months. We still today hear that growth will solve our problems. However, we see the social and ecological boundaries of this growth worldwide. Women in Bangladesh producing our clothes under the most horrible conditions, but I also learned, for example, women in Serbia, for example, and that's not so far away. We know that 49% of worldwide pollution is caused by only 1% of the population, and we are at the brink of the sixth, not the first, but the sixth mass extinction event. As I already pointed out, we are facing already massive social consequences, poverty and unrest, although the actual impact of the crisis mentioned has not yet hit as hard as it will if we do not act fast and act now. Our common goal has to be an equal society, and what this means is clear: a place where every single person can live a good life without hunger, but with solidarity and mutual respect. And together with a strong trade union movement, we can achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. And speaking in the name of the European Parliament, we see that the agenda has broadened, and you remind us that something like, which is so obvious, gender inequality, and to achieve the equality, it's a long, bumpy process, and we are far to achieve. So even for something that should be obvious and we should reach really easily, there is still some problem, but good that we are doing progress. So thank you again. And now we go online. Sorry. We go online with Sharon. If we see the screen opening. because that's the moment of stress when you are, that's the stress is arranged. All seems okay. Nice to have you with us. As you had another appointment, you cannot be in presence, but it's a pleasure to that you are with us online. So without more delay, because we are already a little bit late, I give you the floor. Sharon.
Thank you, Philippe, and I'll try to keep it short in deference to your time. And I do apologize, you're only at the other end of the city, but I'm sandwiched between time. So what I wanted to say is thank you for addressing what was the actual global shock and was recognized even by the employer community pre-COVID as a global risk, is indeed the historical levels of inequality. And every other element of crisis now indeed, you know, an intersection of an impact on working people is inequality. So whether it's the climate crisis and indeed the impact on lives and livelihoods of extreme events, whether it's indeed the COVID pandemic, which exposed the fractures in the labour market, or whether it's now, of course, the multiplier impact of the disruption of the abhorrent invasion of Ukraine, then we know that working people are indeed facing the conundrum of managing without having wages that actually equate with working conditions, let alone consumption demands. And of course, we have an environment where jobs, despite the talk of a tight labour market, are actually very precarious. And of course, that tight labour market, I will argue, is short-lived, and it will be, and it is only a slice of the global economy. So let me start where Luca actually was painting the picture of what I would call a broken labour market. You actually have governments who failed to regulate the labour market, either at the behest of the lobbying of the corporations and corporate greed, or indeed because of their own ideological persuasion. But when you have a global workforce that is 60% informal and growing, and it's not limited to developing economies, we are now seeing with new and emerging areas of business, particularly the platform economy or internet mediated work, we are seeing informality leach in to the formal economy. The 40% of the global labour market that is in the formal economy has more than a third of the workforce actually, while on some form of employment contract, increasingly in precarious or insecure work. We just settled the terminology after a 10-year debate at the ILO with the employers on insecurity. We can live with that. This is insecure work. Non-standard forms of work is increasingly the norm, but if it's insecure as well, if it doesn't have a secure employment contract, if you're not guaranteed social protection, you don't earn a decent labour income share or wages depending on the nature of the job, then that is in fact not a job that we would recognise as decent work. So if you've got that broken labour market, then you're going to have massive inequality between workers and within and between countries, and that's the picture we face. As I indicated, that inequality was in fact acknowledged by the OECD as a global risk, some 5 or 6 years ago. But we now face a deepening of that. And in addition to that, I was pleased that your introduction picked up the even greater disparity for women, because during COVID-19, women lost a combined income share of around $800 billion. That's an extraordinary figure to get your head around. And of the people who simply left the labour market, up to 80% of them were women. So when we talk about tight labour markets, some people, particularly women, are simply missing in action. But on the question of inequality, then indeed we can't forget what Lucas said, that it's indeed a package across jobs, across rights and decent work, universal social protection, and we would all say inclusion. Inclusion of women, inclusion of migrant workers, inclusion of refugees. These are the labour market conditions that have to be actually settled with equal treatment, or we will simply see inequality continue to escalate. I was struck by the last speaker, who also picked up on the fact that we are fueling inequality in terms of the share of prosperity that people generally, and working people in particular, through areas of social protection, but through public services, are losing out on because of the failure to look at reform of taxation, progressive taxation first and foremost, but of course the global floor of tax for corporations, and indeed windfall profits. When you look at the global figures, and Oxfam's statistics, I think, demonstrate this admirably, then during the pandemic, 9 new billionaires were created in the US alone in pharmaceutical companies. And yet we had the scandal of the denial of vaccines to the rest of the world, or a vaccine nationalism. We're now seeing the same level of nationalism around food, and the monopolies that are involved in the production and the distribution of food are actually again creating windfall profits at a time of spiraling prices for working people. So we are not in an environment where any of the policies being put in place serve us well. And what we're now actually risking is a multiplier impact of inequality, because you've seen that 43 countries have actually raised interest rates. At this point in time, when in fact growth is falling way behind inflation, then that's absolutely the worst possible policy, because it will mean that any job opportunities are indeed short-lived, as the economy will contract with stagflation and the risk of recession. You've then got a situation where 50 countries globally are already asking the IMF for help. Now, I've heard Luca warn repeatedly about back to the future with austerity policies. And that's exactly what will happen if our voices aren't loud enough around IMF policy, because you know the way it operates, all of you, that there will be conditionalities, and it will be on public spending, which of course goes to the public wage bill, but also to services and of course social protection. So I don't have a positive message about the state of the world. What I do have, though, is the challenge to us all to indeed to not repeat, Luca, but to just emphasize that the social contract, putting the new social contract in place, is and has always been the basis of the way we deal with both opportunity and equality. We need to make sure that we return to full employment. We need the central banks to make sure that they have a mandate for full employment. We want to know that the jobs that come from that are climate-friendly jobs, and that they are accompanied by just transition measures, so we don't have stranded workers or indeed stranded communities. There's no doubt that the UN Secretary General has heard our message. He's put in place on the road to the Common Agenda Summit in 2025, where he's already located the social contract and social dialogue at the heart of those deliberations. He's put in place a global accelerator for jobs and social protection. We need the EU, we need the individual countries to identify what the impediments are to full employment, but also what the opportunities are. By our estimation, we will still need some 575 million new jobs in the formal economy, And we can have those jobs with investment in care, in infrastructure, and in climate transition. I won't elaborate in the interest of time. While there are indeed a couple of sectors that we will have to pay attention to, most sectors in transition, and every sector will have to transition, every industry, to meet our climate challenges, will generate more jobs. Our challenge as unions is to organise to make them good union jobs. We know that investment in care is one of the fastest multipliers of growth in the economy. Plus, it frees women to work in the broader economy, another dramatic multiplier impact on both workplace participation for women and indeed on equality. And finally, we know that the infrastructure deficit, some related to climate, some related to soft infrastructure like health, but overall, the infrastructure deficit is incredibly significant, and there are jobs in this in almost every sector. So can we put the social contract, jobs, rights, social protection, and indeed inclusion and equality of income with minimum living wages and collective bargaining? And I congratulate the ETUC on the progress on the minimum wage directive. This is a major boost, not just for European countries and workers who've been excluded from decent wages, but indeed for the world, for us to leverage off. And I urge you all to support our call for universal social protection and a social protection fund, a global fund, not a big pot of money, but an arrangement whereby we can aggregate both fiscal space at the domestic level or the national level, but indeed also debt relief, debt elimination, debt restructuring, ODA. If it's scandalous how little of the current amount of ODA is spent on social protection. And indeed, if we can get it to 7% in the short term and 14% in the long term, we build a resilience floor that also builds economies. And we know that that investment returns up to 1.9% to the economy. If we have equality for women and equality of race, and that means inclusion in terms of equal treatment for all groups in the labour market, then we're on track. We're on track to getting the SDGs, the Paris Climate Agreement, if those jobs are climate-friendly jobs. And of course, if we hold corporations to account, yes, for taxation, but also with due diligence for rights and environmental standards, accompanied by grievance procedures at all levels to effect remedy. There is a major debate on in the ILO next week, another attempt to get employers to face up to the dehumanising impact of supply chains, but also to the need for reform in supply chains in terms of the global economy, so that we don't repeat the failed economic model and the lessons of the past in terms of responding to crisis. So I thank you. There can be nothing more important than putting the social contract with its key elements of working people and their families at the heart of the solutions for inequality.
Thank you. Thank you. Sharon, for putting this global vision when we see part are the same problem, but there is also very specific problem, and it's important that we take into consideration this dimension and that we achieve this global new contract that you were speaking. So we move immediately to the next speaker. We spoke already a little bit about the OECD that changed or had important document about inequality a few years, 5-6 years ago, and we have the chance to have with us Sebastian Koenigs. Thank you for being with us. If you can keep in 10 minutes, because we need a break between the two sessions. But thank you for joining, and I give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure and a privilege for me to be able to participate in today's plenary session. I'd like to start as well with apologies for not being able to be there in person. I had planned to come to Brussels. It's not very far from Paris, where we're based. But I had a small accident 10 days ago, and I'm slightly incapacitated at the moment, so I couldn't move. So I would have preferred to be there en présentiel. I had actually prepared a short presentation, but I think I'm going to skip this now. As you all know, we at the OECD, we like our numbers and statistics, and I thought I'd kick off the discussion by showing some of these. But I think there's too little time now, and there's the colleague from the ILO speaking after me, so I'm going to try to keep myself short. I agree a lot with the opening remarks that you've Philippe and Luca have made on the policy side. And in fact, at the OECD, we just finished a meeting of OECD labor ministers that we had 2 weeks ago, I think, in Paris, where I think about 30 labor ministers attended. This meeting had been scheduled for 2020 and had to be postponed several times. And I had the pleasure of participating in some of these sessions and in the breakout sessions. And one of the conclusions that very clearly came out of these discussions at the very highest level that we only have every so many years, because as you can imagine, they're very complicated to organize, is indeed that there's a near consensus that addressing rising inequalities and high inequalities absolutely needs to be a policy priority now moving out of the crisis. And indeed that there cannot be a trade-off between economic growth and social inclusion. You've alluded a bit to the work we've done on this topic. It sounded like a little bit, Philippe, at the start that you said like that the OECD has made a massive shift on these topics. And if I may, I'd like to push back a bit against that, because we've been working on inequalities really for decades now, especially in my directorate. I'm working in the directorate for employment, labor, and social affairs, and we the first major flagship report that we published on the topic was, I think, in 2008, called "Growing Unequal." Back then, it was still with a question mark. But then we had Divided We Stand in 2011. We've been working on social mobility and the middle classes a lot over the last year. So this is a topic that's very very close to our hearts, and also for me personally, and that we've been pushing a lot. Now, instead of my presentation, just a couple of thoughts. I think we've been talking a lot already about the long-term trends. And about some of the more short-term impact that the crisis has had. I'm currently working and finalizing a chapter of our Employment Outlook, which is our annual flagship publication on employment trends. And we're in that publication, we're taking stock what the policy development and the policy reaction has been of OECD countries during the now 2.5 years since the crisis started. And what we're seeing, first of all, is that it's a bit early to tell exactly how the crisis has affected inequality, just because the data that we at the OECD like to work with on incomes and on wealth, for instance, these data, collecting these data takes a lot of time. They come with a lot of lag. So when we're being asked about, okay, what's been the impact of the crisis on inequalities, we have to say, to be honest, we don't really know yet. We don't have internationally available household income data, and even less so household wealth data. So we're still a bit in a room, in a situation where we're kind of having to patch together the pieces of the puzzle, and we're working with some of the data that are available. What we're seeing is that countries have made enormous efforts when the crisis hit to kind of secure both jobs and incomes as countries and economies were moving into lockdown. And some of the data we have for countries, mostly still for the year 2020 at least, shows that some of these initiatives have been very, very successful. So I've been myself working with some German microdata from a special module of the German socioeconomic panel, for instance, and we're seeing there that at least in the first year of the crisis, actually, it's been the top income groups that have suffered the income losses, and the middle and the low income groups have been relatively protected. There are similar results for other countries, but these are really just preliminary results that we have for a couple of countries in the first crisis years. What we know more broadly about the labor market, however, is clearly that vulnerable groups have been disproportionately hit by the shock. That applies to workers on non-standard contracts, to young people, and to the low-skilled, because they were more likely to work in heavily affected sectors. They had weaker employment protection, often temporary contracts, and in some cases they were less able to telework. They were also covered less well by social protection systems, and that applies both to the standard social protection that was in place, but also to some of the emergency measures that were rolled out, including job retention schemes or short-time work that was in most countries very much focused on standard jobs. Besides that, there's of course a much broader social impact on the crisis. For instance, on women in terms of the very high unpaid work burden, the effects we're seeing on children and young people through homeschooling, or the direct health impact, mental health impact of the lockdowns on the frail and elderly. Now the recovery is still very fragile, and as societies are kind of moving out of the crisis, we now have the challenges that are rising from Russia's horrible aggressive war in Ukraine, which I'm not going to go into detail now because they've been mentioned a few times. Maybe just in terms of the policy solutions, 4 things that I would like to mention, I think, that are key to addressing some of these inequalities. The first one is to further enhance labor market participation. And there we're talking about especially of women. And then we're not talking about just the extensive margin, how many women are in the labor market, but also very much the intensive margin, so the number of hours worked. The solutions here are good quality, affordable childcare, but also bringing in more fathers to take parental leave. Then improvements in job quality, notably for disadvantaged groups, and when we're talking about working conditions, and of course earnings and wages, where better social dialogue plays an essential role. Then to us, a key solution, and I think this is something that we haven't heard much so far, is to really prioritize education and training over the entire working life, or rather over the entire life. So including good quality and affordable early childhood education and care, but then also adult learning. And then the 4th point that's been alluded to a couple of times is to again strengthen the redistributive function of taxes and benefits. And then we're talking clearly about wealth-related taxes, property taxation, wealth transfers, so inheritances, capital gains, but also environmental taxes. And then on the other side, we also have the social protection side, notably for those who are uncovered, and we've seen that during the crisis. This is important both if we're talking about the burden itself of the COVID-19 crisis, which is still very much there, also in terms of the higher debt levels that have been alluded to, but it's incredibly important also when we're thinking about the green transition and just the need to gain kind of public majorities and a consensus for very, very difficult reforms and transformation, and to bringing everyone on board. And I'm going to keep it there, and I think I've kept my 10 minutes very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian, and sorry to put some pressure on you, and I just verify you are right. The first report was 2008 in October, so it's
no problem at all.
It's almost 15 years that the debate is growing in the OECD, but it's very important, and I think what you said about tax is really also important, as Luca put kind of broader picture at the beginning. So we have the chance now to have with us Anne Scholar from ILO, and ILO play an important role, and recently there was all the discussion about health and safety as a key right for everyone, and I'll let you the floor, and if you can keep also the 10 minutes, that will be fantastic.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philip. Thank you very much, Luca, for the invitation, and congratulations to both of you to organize this event. Good afternoon to everybody. Congratulations to your resilience to be still here. So I think it's a testimony of your interest in this subject. And also I would like to pass the greetings of the Director General Guy Ryder to you. He knows that I'm here, and he asked me to give you his best.
Thank you.
So basically, inequality is an important topic, and I have 3 messages for you. First message, this is an issue of historic dimension. Fighting inequalities had been at the heart of the ILO since its creation. The preamble of the 1990 ILO Constitution already mentioned the recognition of the principle of equal remuneration. You will be glad to hear that, I guess, for work of equal value. Among the measures to be taken to improve working conditions and foster social justice. By the way, social justice is also a precondition for peace. I think that's important to stress in these times. Moreover, the 1944 Philadelphia Declaration, our Magna Carta, if you like, makes a clear reference to economic security and equal opportunity. I think the connection is very important. It is therefore no coincidence that two equality-related conventions adopted already in the 1950s, Convention 100 on equal pay and Convention 111 on non-discrimination in employment, have been included into the fundamental principles and rights at work, along with freedom of association and collective bargaining, prohibition of forced labor and child labor, and now the latest, safe and healthy working environments. Again, that is the outcome of the ILC. It was alluded, we had 3,000 people live in Geneva, and they promoted occupational safety and work to this fundamental principle and right at work, which is an historic decision, the first since 1998 to be promoted. Second message is there is a great divergence and the progress has stalled or being reserved on equality. In recent decades, the growing inequalities within and between countries, we have to look at both issues, have emerged as a major concern because of the adverse social, economic and political consequences. Luca alluded already to the global financial crisis and the way that was handled. Now we face the devastating social and economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, combined with the, you cannot call it otherwise, the war in Ukraine and the ensuing rise in energy and food prices and the ugly head of inflation raising his head again. So this has heightened our concern and stressed the need for urgent action. In his opening address to the International Labour Conference last month, the ILO director, Guy Ryder, pointed out the great divergence that has resulted from an uneven recovery process, making an already unequal world more unequal still. I think that goes along with what many of the speakers before me had said. However, we have to admit that before 2020, the inequality between countries had indeed tended to diminish, even though absolute differences in GDP per capita between the richest and the poorest countries have increased. That's a little irony there. The rising average incomes in some of the large emerging countries, including China, Indonesia, and India, has actually contributed to less global inequality. We also need to look a little bit outside the European Union. However, and it's also clear, the pandemic has changed the picture, including in Europe. As shown by the findings of the ETUI report, the impact of the pandemic has interrupted our fight against inequality, if not cancelled the progress we have made so far. In the same way, the 9th ILO Monitor on the World of Work reveals that more than 2 years after the start of the pandemic, most workers, admittedly outside the European Union, have not recovered their labor incomes, and the gender pay gap and the gender gap in hours worked has continued to grow during the pandemic. Sharon was alluding to that one. Moreover, the current increase in food and commodity prices is badly hurting poor households and small businesses. We also need to look a little bit not only at labor, but also on businesses, especially those in the informal economy. Indeed, 2 billion workers in the informal economy have been among the hardest hit and are more likely to fall into poverty and face serious decent work deficits, starting with the lack of social protection. Let me tell you something. Maybe one of the very few positive outcomes of the COVID crisis is that governments look differently at social protection systems. They understand these days that social protection is not a cost, but it's an investment. I think that's very important to notice. That leads me to my third message. The way forward must be coordinated at all levels. Therefore, the 2030 agenda goals of reducing inequality and promoting inclusive growth are more important than ever. That is why the 2019 ILO Centenary Declaration on the Future of Work and our 2021 Call to Action for Human-Centered Recovery are strongly aligned with the agenda of reducing inequality. More recently, And there we pride ourselves of being a little bit of a front runner. In December 2021, the International Labour Conference had a specific discussion on the subject and adopted conclusions on inequalities in the world of work that are obviously perfectly in line with our discussion today. For the first time, this text gives a comprehensive picture of inequalities as a multifaceted phenomenon that was already referred to by you, Philip, and a global challenge that requires urgent action. The conclusions identify the different types of inequalities within and among countries, their causes and underlying drivers. It recalls that inequalities are rooted in a complex and multidimensional combination of economic, social, trade, investment, labor and employment policies and practices. Poverty, informality, discrimination, lack of labor law rights, and social protection are strong contributing factors to inequalities. Within countries, there are huge inequalities depending on the categories of workers. For example, in Europe, I have to say this, migrants from outside the European Union face a risk of poverty that is multiple times higher than that of EU nationals and tend to have lower average income levels. That is why the conference conclusion put forward a comprehensive and integrated strategy to address and prevent inequalities in the world of work, focusing on the 7 following areas. First, promoting inclusive and sustainable growth, employment creation, and decent work for all. Second, fostering equal opportunity and access to education and training. I can only underline what the colleague from the OECD said. This is really very important. Third, ensuring adequate protection of all workers and a fair share of the fruits of progress. Fourth, accelerating transition to formality. Fifth, fostering equality and non-discrimination, diversity and inclusion. We heard that from Sharon. Number 6, promote trade and development for a fair globalization. And 7, implementing universal social protection. This strategy is intended to help ILO member states accelerate actions to reduce and prevent inequalities in the world of work and ensure that no one is left behind. To get there, a lot needs to be done, using all available instruments, including development cooperation and the ILO's decent work country programs at the national level. The ILO governing body will have the opportunity to further develop the strategy in November, when it will discuss a follow-up action plan to these conclusions with a view to implementing it at the country level. So we really try to break down the global strategy to the country level. I think that's the important message here. National plans to reduce and prevent inequalities in the world of work will be developed in consultation with our ILO's tripartite constituents, obviously, and other relevant partners, including UN agencies. A monitoring system with a core set of inequality indicators will be established. Impact assessment studies highlighting what has worked and probably more important, what has not worked, will be developed. Moreover, and that's also a message coming from Sharon, the member states emphasize the need to engage urgently in stronger multilateral cooperation in coordination with all international organizations to fight inequalities, including international financial institutions. We keep hearing by now quite interesting signals from the World Bank, from the IMF on this, and the Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection is a good example how this could be done. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that such concerns are shared by all of you and by the European Union. In terms of practical implementation, many issues currently under discussion relate to inequality. Look at the agenda of the last EBSCO Council meeting. I think in particular of the national targets to deliver on the European Action Plan on Poverty, Skills and Employment, the political agreement on adequate minimum wages, which is obviously very strongly applauded by the ILO, the employment for people with disabilities, the draft directive on equal pay, the directive on equal treatment, and also the proposed directive on gender balance on company boards. You should not forget in the European Union that you serve as a role model for the rest of the world. Therefore, this is so important. I can tell you when I go out there, Central Asia, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, probably never heard of the places, very difficult to get there, but they look at the European Union. So let me sum up in pointing out that also the new Director General-elect has campaigned with the clear demand for a new global social contract, which I think is very much in line with you promoting, Luca. And to sum up and to finish, the world of work based on social dialogue plays a crucial role for reducing inequalities. That's sometimes forgotten, I'm afraid. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Hans. I don't think that I was the best to manage the time, but I think we had fantastic speech. We really are at the center of what we want to organize. So the price to pay is that we will have only 10 minutes for the coffee break, but we return, let's say, in 35 for the presentation of Thomas Piketty that I think many of you are waiting for. So thank you all the speaker online and here, and just have a quick coffee break or tea break